you've transcended a liminal threshold into History Fuzz, a realm of contemplative inquiry in which leading researchers discuss the motivations, tools and skills of the skywatchers, surveyors, architects and builders who delineated monumental landscapes with awe-inspiring structures, enshrining their diverse cosmic chronicles in stone. I'm your host, Ashley Cowie. You can unlock videos, maps, articles, and enjoy early ad-free new episodes by becoming a member on historyfuzz.com, where you can also apply to join our team exploring and filming archaeology documentaries in the Andean highlands of Colombia. Professor Helen Benigni and Barbara Carter co-authored the best-selling book, The Myth of the Year, Returning to the Origin of the Druid Calendar. Exploring where the night sky meets ancient mythology, in this far-reaching episode you'll learn how lunar and Venetian astronomy inspired ancient builders to monumentalize key stages in the cycles of the moon and Venus. And after delineating the archaeoastronomy of Celtic and Roman temple architecture, the researchers outlined some of the esoteric aspects of Bronze Age calendrical rituals associated with the moon and Venus, illuminating ancestral knowledge through the study of constellations, and presenting supporting artifacts from Ice Age Europe. Helen and Barbara systematically unveil the origins of seasonal myths, revealing the deities of a lesser-known Palaeolithic pantheon.
We wrote the book, The Myth of the Year, based on the Coligny calendar, which was discovered by Ian McNeill in 1926. Originally, the artifact was uncovered at the end of the 19th century, maybe 1899. And Ian McNeill was an Irish scholar, and he wrote an article called On the Calendar of Coligny for Eru magazine, which is a journal of Irish learning devoted to Irish philology and literature by the Royal Irish Academy in 1926. And they were looking at the calendar, and it was a parapegma, so it was a small, the size of a small door, a bronze tablet the size of a small door with 5 columns on it. Mm-hmm. And each column had little holes in it so they could move the holes around. That's a parapegma. There are 5 parapegmas in the world today from the ancient world. And then there's the anti-Kythera device that was discovered off of the Peloponnese in Greece. So it was obviously one of these calendars that all matched. So he went ahead and they were looking at it and trying to do a linguistic analysis of it, thinking it was P Gaelic or Q Gaelic. And Barbara took a look at it, our astronomer, and she said it's a language of astronomy. And the notations, such as for Venus are Innis, and for Mercury are Evos, and the notations are not a language, but a language of astronomy. So she decoded the language, booted it up to the present day, and we're talking something that's probably 7,000 years old, and it works to the day exactly. So this is an extremely accurate artifact. You look like you want to ask a question.
Absolutely. You're saying that it tallies or works functionally as a lunar calendar. Now, a skeptic might say less than half the tablet has been found and assembled. So are you quite confident in its functionality, considering that maybe 40% exists of the actual tablet? Do you think the way you filled the gaps is sufficient enough to assume that it really is a lunar calendar?
Well, I'll let Barbara answer that. But the lacuna that you're speaking of, in the mythology of the calendar and the stars, the Attic calendar of Greece matches it. So I was able to put the mythology together where the lacuna was gone. And then how were you?
Yeah.
Well, the Royal Irish Academy had already filled in the missing lacuna, or else they had admitted to where it was. And what I saw immediately, I saw that it was a lunar calendar, because they had the first half of the lunar month on one half of the calendar, and then the second half of the lunar month that was divided. So I could see that through all the months. And we had a 5-year calendar, and I was working from large sheets that had all 5 years across. So Somenos was 5 years across. And I was able to see immediately that it was a lunar calendar. But what I didn't know is what was this strange preemie love. That's really how it was spelled.
Mm-hmm.
And preemie lag. And I'm like, what is this? And I took about 6 months while my husband was watching TV. I was watching a planisphere, trying to find out what's a preemie love? What's a preemie love? And then all of a sudden I saw what they were looking at. The preemie love, or the preemie lag, for every month was a primary star. And there's 15 of first magnitude stars in our hemisphere. And they had 12 months that they could use for these. And as soon as I got that on there, I could find out what the preemies were that they were talking about. So then it ended up that it was a solar. It was keeping track of the solar for sure. It was keeping track of the lunar. And now I knew it was also keeping track of the stellar.
Then she gave me the names of these primary stars, and I put together the 4 patterns of stars. If each moon had a star, then each season had 3 primary stars in 3 primary constellations. And those formed a pattern of stories in the sky, so that we could tell you a little bit about each of what those stories are.
I'd like to ask you if the functionality of the Coligny calendar has been compared to the mechanisms of the Antikythera device.
No.
Not that we know of.
Or not exactly.
I've seen the Antikythera device, and it seems more, because it's gears, it seems more like the Mayan calendar, with the gears almost like not concentric, but interlocked, where ours is columns.
Okay. I wonder if the geometric arrangement or the numerology might be reflected for, say, 56, the important lunar number. Are there 56 cogs on one of the wheels? Or 62 being another very important lunar number. What do you think?
I think where the parallel with the circular interconnecting circles or concentric circles is, ours is a Bronze Age tablet that was taken off of the stones. So in other words, they took the information from the megalithic monuments, especially Stonehenge, and they put that information in columns. So originally, if you look at Stonehenge, the outer circle is 3 metonic cycles, 55.8. Then the next 2 are I think Z and Y circles, and they are 29 and 30 stones, and they are our months to make up for the lunar exactitude of 29.5 or 2930, 2930. And they're called Mat and Am. So they moved a stone around those holes from the 29 month to the 30 to the 29 to the 30 month. Then the inner circle of Stonehenge is the Metonic. Is 19, 18.6 or 19. And then the inner one is 5 Inside that are 5 stones, and those would be for the 5 years of our calendar. So if our calendar has 5 columns, those 5 columns repeat eternally, and those are the 5 blue stones, the trilithons in the center. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, but I have this wall in my head. So at Stonehenge, there's 56 stones in a circle, right?
Right, and the outside circle.
So that must be symbolic of the lunar cycle, because the moon never is seen in the north, so the stones in the north of a circle would never be functional. So it must be purely symbolic of the lunar cycle, yeah? No?
I guess. What, Barbara?
The portals of the stones would never interact with the moon in the north. So the number, the numerology is correct, but it wouldn't function as a way of monitoring the moon because it doesn't appear in the northeast or the northwest ever.
Well, we ourselves never look in the north for the moon, except in the middle of the summertime.
Yeah.
Most of us don't understand that the winter moon follows the path of the summer sun.
Winter moon follows the path of the sun. Oh, I see. Really? Okay, I get that.
Okay, now turn that around, and the summer moon follows the path of the winter sun.
Okay.
Okay, so we're only able to keep track of the moon by a few days of the moon.
Yeah.
But these people were able to keep track of the moon every single day. Whether it was cloudy or not, they still would know where the moon was. And it was so important to them to know where the moon was that they were always on the lookout for where the moon was.
Yesterday I talked to a Dr. Mies, who is a researcher in Germany, and he's written a paper on the Magdalenenborg site in Germany. And he was explaining to me how the lunar maximums and the lunar minima are expressed within the mounds surrounding the site. But then he said to me, for an unknown reason, 62 timber post holes were found surrounding the site. And then when I looked at your work on the calendar and realised that 5 times 12 plus 2 fixed days is 62, that number is possibly symbolic of the Coligny calendar. Do you understand my proposition there? That they're both possibly representing the number 62 in different ways, one with timber posts in Germany and one with the calendar in France. Do you think that's perhaps coincidence or not?
No, that's how it is in the sky. And so a proper rendition of that would include what you termed the dead moon, or that we call it the intercalary moon.
Yes.
We need to have those moons in there also so that we can keep the solar calendar intact with the lunar calendar.
Yeah, I live in Colombia and I live in the Valley of the Moon, 4 miles from the chief temple of the moon. We're going to get to that at the end. But their most sacred number was the number of fingers and toes, so 20 full moons was the year. But they had what was called the Zokam, the priestly year, and that was 36 months plus 1 intercalendary month that was called the deaf month, the month with no ears. And it's beautiful because it reflects the same system as the calendar in France here to synchronize the lunisolar calendar.
Yeah, this is our page.
Could you now, considering that the audience can't see this, I'd love you to describe, tell me what that is, but describe what we're looking at there.
Okay, we had 3 artists design the calendar and do silkscreen prints of it. And the lunar cycle starts on the left in the first quarter moon. So we put it in a visual, and I uploaded this, if anyone wants to look, I uploaded this to my academia.edu website, and it's called the Moon, I called it the Moon Cycle Calendar 2024.
Brilliant. So if people search the Moon Cycle Calendar 2024, they should see this.
Well, actually, it's 2024 to 2027. So we put up 3 years of it.
Oh.
And yeah, it's right at the top and it's easy to find so that you can use it. We ended it at 27 because I could only do 100,000 megabytes, and our graphics took up so many megabytes that we had to end it after 3 years. But I'll put up every year, I'll put up the next year and take off, you know what I mean? Take off 2024 and put up the next year.
Think of what you've just said. It's so suggestive. What you've said is you don't have the computational power to generate 3 years of moon data. Imagine what it was like in the Bronze Age.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
That used to be done in the head.
We also had our artists be able to do this work on paper, and they were doing theirs in stone.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And we have ways to do 3D interpretations of the cosmos. They were looking at the 3D, but they had to replicate that in 2D. That is really difficult. Go from the 3D stellatum to a 2D image, or that's really, really clever.
These guys used bronze, and they carved in bronze on top of a bronze plate. So they had 2 levels of bronze they were carving in for the Pyrrhopegma.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So for our intercalary month, it's a circle. The artist designed this as a circle, and it starts on the left, and it starts with the first quarter moon. Now the Greeks started a few days before that in their Attic calendar, but it's the same calendar. And then it moves around, and the full moon's at the top, and then it moves around clockwise, and then the new moon is directly at the bottom. In the center of the intercalary, the artist chose to put Omios, the god of Om, and we did this all in Gaulish. I took all the Gaulish deities to respect the Sequani tribe. So Omios was on an Armacorian coin, and this is the artist's interpretation of the face of the coin. And just to read you for a second, the intercalary moon of the calendar is included before the winter or the summer solstice as a time collected by the Druid astronomers for the people in order that their calendar balances the lunar and solar cycles. Every 2.5 years, in order to justify the difference between 365 days of the solar year and 355 days of the lunar year, the Druids added an intercalary moon alternately before each solstice. The nights of the intercalary moon represent, in their respective order, each moon throughout the year. In a sense, it is a bringing together of lunar time to balance solar time. And you wanted to say what that
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to say is that when they took a day like of Samanos and said this is an intercalary month, I listed all of those days, one after another, and I found out that the days they took were sociologically, statistically consistent with the meteor showers. So that if you saw on your calendar that this was an intercalary night, then you could go outside in the early morning of that night and see the meteor showers.
Okay, hold on.
I know. How could they do that?
That's still just one of my questions. The how. One moment. What does that suggest?
You mean metaphorically or in mythology?
What must they have done to key into meteor showers which aren't predictable? They're not like the solstice sunrise.
Well, they are.
How are they? Tell me.
They are predictable by the year.
Really?
They are. My husband right now is getting ready to go to our local park with one of his best friends so that they can stay up all night in their hammocks and watch the meteor showers. They're the greatest meteor showers that we have here in the Northern Hemisphere.
Oh my good Lord.
and they're the Perseus meteor showers. And if you Google meteor showers, like I have, then you'll come up with a list. I have right here in my package of papers a list of all the meteor showers that we know.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when the meteor itself burns out, as it comes off of the sun, when it finally burns out,
Mm-hmm.
then we don't see that meteor shower anymore.
Okay, but you've been able to go back in time with and figure out that those calendrical days occur when there's meteor showers.
Right.
I have so far in the last 8 weeks interviewed 22 leading professors of archaeoastronomy. Not one of them has mentioned, whether cosmologically or astronomically, meteors in this whole game. I just think that's a whole new level. It's going to make me sound really smart in my next interview because I'm going to bring it up.
The other thing we found out is that when you follow the inner calorie month, you can get up when the moon rises every single day, and you can follow the picture of the sky.
Yep.
From inside where the meteor showers are. You can follow the sky in the inner calorie month if you get up at the right time with the moon.
What do you mean you can follow the sky? You can follow the moon or the sky?
You can follow the picture of the sky that the moon is performing night by night.
And it's not about getting up in time because back then, everything before the Industrial Revolution, you got up before the first spark. You had to get things done before light came, so that would make absolute sense.
And like the meteor showers, you were already up watching the bonfire and telling the stories of the sky, and you could actually see the stars as you're watching, or you could see the meteor showers as you're telling the stories.
So what you're really doing here is answering another major question. Let's branch off for a second. I plant indigenous corn and potatoes here in the high Andes following the cycles of the moon.
Right.
I don't need a calendar, a priest, or a shaman to tell me what time of the day it is. I glance the sun and I know. I know what time of the year it is because I see the sun on the mountain to the west. If I can do that, everybody in prehistory could tell local time by glancing. But here's the question. You can't do that with the moon because it's difficult. But what you're suggesting is that everybody was exposed to lunar knowledge through a cosmic theatre that was happening every day. It was so ingrained in the culture that it was like a storybook or a theatre in the sky daily.
Right.
Yeah.
My PhD is in literature. So I understand the stories that they tell night by night and the stars that are connected with them. But the knowledge that you guys are talking about on the level of the inner calorie is for the Druids. That's for the Druid astronomers. Then the people like myself, now that I've been on this calendar for 20 years, I know what moon it is. I know what night it is. I know what stars are out. So there's a simple level to it for the people. And then there's another level where the Druids kept the processional cycles of the moon.
Yes, yes.
Do you see what I'm saying? So there are two levels to it.
And our friend Anthony Murphy, who wrote the
Islands of the Setting Sun.
Islands of the Setting Sun with Richard Moore. Okay, he says that there are places even now in Ireland where in the backwoods they can chant the times of how much the 19-year cycle is starting away from the winter solstice. They can chant that. They have a chant that actually says 5 days, 10 days. I don't know it by heart, but they have it.
In Ireland.
Right. That they still have that because they still know when the real cycle starts at the winter solstice, but they also want to start that cycle on the first quarter moon.
Fabulous.
And I was saying, I think the reason that the Celts knew this, had this information, is because they're much more tribally oriented than, say, the Romans, who just come in, have a solar calendar and a government that governs all people. And people like Vercingetorix tried to get all the Celts together, and it was almost impossible. And I think one of the reasons is because they had their own stone circles. Like if you go to Wales, to Penman they have their own circle. Do you know what I mean? So everybody knew it in a really practical.
Yeah, I just interviewed Charles Stanish, a leading archaeoastronomer, especially in Peru, and we were talking about the Paracas culture, which was about 1500 BC. Charles said to me that this existed because they were non-state societies. Where you have Rome with a state, what happens is all the small localized temples are done away with and pilgrimages made to state temples.
Right.
But in Bronze Age France and in 1500 BC on the west coast of Peru, it was localized rulers and localized communities of druids, or a priesthood, I suppose. And Vercingetorix represented the Gallic tribes, but he wasn't the leader of them until the Romans arrived, was he?
Very difficult to get them together. And then when I was in the Netherlands, they called these, I call them personal or tribal circles and Stonehenge. They were called the Hunebeds.
What?
The Hunebeds, Hunebeds. So they're along the border between the Netherlands and Germany. Each little tribe had their own stone circle, like in Wales or Ireland. So you're right. It is a tribal, and it's an intuitive thing as well. When you start following the moon and I'm on the third, it doesn't matter what the name is. If it's Kudios in Gaulish, or if the name is something else in Greek, you get a sense intuitively of where you are in the universe.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You learn to tell time by the night sky. And then if you're into planting, and I'm into herbs, of course, the psychologically, the first quarter moon is the beginning of the cycle for growth, plants, and then the full moon is the flowering, and then for editing, I start writing on the new. I get my ideas on the new moon, first quarter moon. I start writing. I edit on the third quarter. So we're all on this cycle anyway. And then lately I've been I shouldn't even bring this up. This is a whole nother thing. But lately I've been editing for this magazine, Journal of Goddess Studies. And they've been introducing this Asian calendar that's based on 28 days.
Okay.
And that's the menstrual cycle.
Yeah.
So just to throw it out there, when you have your period on this, because it's 28 days, every time you have a period, it goes backwards counterclockwise through this calendar.
Yeah. Where I am, the Moisca civilization, their moon goddess Chia was worshipped in three aspects, representing the mother, the maiden, and the crone, the three classic feminine archetypes. But more than that, she was the mistress of everything fluid, water, lagoons, wells, the tides, the sea.
Right.
The same thing.
Yeah, in Asian, it's the whale. And for us, that's what I was going to talk about a little bit. We have the Neolithic pantheon in this calendar, in the 4 seasons. The summer is the grandmother, the crone, the great mother goddess of the waters, the birds, and the snakes. Also at Knossos, holding the very popular goddess. The fall is the mother. In Greek, Demeter. I'll do them in Greek. That's easy for everybody. In the summer, it's Hera. And I call her timekeeper, earth keeper, star keeper. She's the keeper of the garden. She's the keeper of the cycles. She's the keeper of the produce. And she's the keeper of the cosmos, because she married Zeus. Well, Zeus married her. She was Rhea before that, and she was Gaia before that. Okay, so that's the great mother. That's summer. And the constellations are the summer triangle and the Milky Way, the waters of the Milky Way. Then in the fall, the mother, and that's Demeter in Greek mythology, and Persephone, the loss of the daughter, and the Trinity, the female Trinity of mother-daughter. And the constellation is Cassiopeia, again named in the late Iron Age.
The swan.
Yeah. Then the winter is Artemis in Greek mythology, the daughter.
Yeah.
And she is the strong, she goes way back. Some of these, I mean, I'm doing through the Neolithic, but some of these go back to the Paleolithic because she's the huntress. She's the animal guide. She's the very strong, and she's Orion because Artemis gave her constellation to Orion, her lover, Orion. So that was originally I call her the great goddess of the winter sky. Then the spring is the sun, the young man, the shaman, even at the front of Lascaux, the shaman who guides you in the fertility symbol, the god of vegetation.
Who would that be represented in Irish mythology? Lud, the sun?
No, Lu is summer. Lu is the summer triangle.
Lu was summer. Okay.
Right. Lunasaw. Lunasaw's August. First calends of August or the first month, August 1st to the 6th. No, the sun god is Asus, Tyrannus, Tutates in Celtic, Osiris in Egyptian, Quetzalcoatl, I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Bochica here, who was married to Chia, the moon goddess.
Yeah. And then Dionysius in Greek, Jesus Christ, Hiawatha, I don't know, maybe I missed one, but it's the dying god, later to be the dying god. Okay, so that's a big one. So those are the 4 deities, and it's matrilocal, with the basis being the grandmother, the mother, and the daughter.
I just wanted to say one thing about the dying god, and that's if you don't clean your fields during that time, then you're going to have a mess in the spring. So thank heavens you can cut down the fields at the end of winter and use that shaft to enrich your soil through the winter into the spring.
So it's a sacrifice. It's the sacrifice of him as a vegetative god, and then he becomes a human sacrifice eventually.
Okay.
But you have to sacrifice the plants, like the vine, especially the vine. And then that changes. I mean, you've got several levels.
Yeah.
Right now I'm trying to put the Paleolithic deities into this too. That's my new research. But the Neolithic fits because it's an agricultural cycle. Then the Bronze Age and the Iron Age follow.
I've got to ask you, because there must be a lot of people who are going to be listening to this asking, good with the Roman, good with the Celtic, Gaulish, good with Irish and Scottish deities, but talk to me about Paleolithic deities. Where on earth do you begin?
Well, that's what I'm trying to do. The one that we've established so far is the moon goddess. And we use the Venus of La Salle as the introduction to that because she's holding the horn of an auric, and there are 13 marks on it back to the inner calorie. So they understood the precessional cycles of the moon, and they knew the importance of that 13. And her other hand, she's on a cave front, so it's curved, and her other hand is pointing to her womb. So we know that there was one figure, of a time-oriented figure. I'm starting to do research on it, and I want to pick Hera, the summer goddess, the goddess of the Milky Way, as the Venus of Willendorf, because they've already, archaeologists have said that the top of her head looks like the cosmos. In other words, she has no face, and that pattern might possibly be the goddess who becomes Hera, or this time-oriented goddess that's counting all the calendrical, and I want to say again that the stories are really important. The mythologies are important because they not only help the ancients understand the night sky and be able to point to the stars, but they help us. It still works. It's a way to learn it. So this ancient knowledge and these ancient goddesses are interesting, but they're applicable because you look up and you see Cassiopeia and you say, oh, I know that story. I'm not just looking at a picture of stars. I'm not just an astronomer looking, but I know the story, and the story relates to the earth. So it's a way to bring the knowledge of the night sky down to earth and connect the two.
Delivering data is mundane and very difficult for the human brain, but if it's given as a story, it becomes exceptionally easy. I have a 14-month-old son. If I tell him to count 3 bananas, he can't do it. If I tell him that the monkey took away one, The bear put in another one. How many's left? He's got it. He's interacts and learns.
Right.
It's the way humans work. We're story receivers and tellers, I think. Back to your stories. Tell me about this Palaeolithic pantheon. I think it's a fantastic concept.
Well, there's one more. There's one more that's controversial. The Venus Dolivestanese. I identified her as the goddess of the eclipses because our calendar also marks the eclipses. So I have an article on my academia.edu site called "The Goddess of the Eclipses," and I'm not, it's very difficult to do. So I'm not sure of that one yet, but I'm trying.
Is that the Venus who's carrying the half moon? This one, the second one you mentioned.
No, this is she's over here. She's the dark goddess with the pendant breast.
Yeah, look at that. Hold that right up to the screen. Let me see that. Oh, yeah. Got you.
Yeah, and found in Danube River. So I don't think, I guess the point is, we may not be able to identify clearly, like in the Neolithic pantheon, where you have Demeter, and her precedents, and the goddesses after her, and all the stories.
Mm-hmm.
But these stories didn't start in 6500 BC. They go back to 38,000, and that's a lot of time. So there may not be a way to identify the pantheon, but we know that there were precedents. That we didn't just start the whole thing cold in the Neolithic.
A few weeks ago, I interviewed Dr. Kenneth Brophy from the University of Glasgow, and he studies Neolithic archaeology in Scotland. And he told me about a site called Warren Field in Aberdeenshire, which is dated to 8000 BC. It has 12 pits, and most archaeologists in Scotland are now convinced that this is the oldest lunisolar calendar that's ever been found. Have you heard of Warren Field?
Mm-mm.
No.
Because that's Mesolithic. That's 8000 BC.
Right.
And when you find a monument like that, that's like the pinnacle of a knowledge set. That didn't just happen.
Right.
So it suggests that lunar information was certainly circulating or monumentalized by 8000 BC in Scotland.
Right.
But then you just brought up a really archaeologically scary date. Did you say 36,000 BC?
38,000.
Where? What was the material artifact there?
Venus of La Salle, I think, and the Venus figurines date that back. And then they're misnomered. They're not Venus. The archaeologists who discovered them, because they were all naked, thought that they're all Aphrodite, and it's like, no, they're not all Venus. So I would like to also work on correcting that misnomer. And the Venus of La Salle, I would call the goddess of the moon goddess of La Salle.
Yeah.
And the Dolivestanese, I would call her the eclipse goddess of Dolivestanese, and so on.
You think there was a mistress of eclipses, a mistress of the solstices, one of fertility, say? Yeah?
Yes. Yeah. I do. Yeah, at Madeleine, La Madeleine caves in France, the reclining, there's another one, the reclining goddesses are really Venus.
Uh-huh.
They're the ones, you know what I mean? They're the ones, because Venus is always leaning back when you see her in statues. And those are the sexy ones. Those are Aphrodite. Those are actually, and they're on the temples that measure the cycles of Venus.
Ah.
You'd mentioned some interest about that.
Yeah, this is a perfect time for me to bring up Venus. We're going to spend a bit of time there. I did a bit of studying about 12 years ago on Norse mythology and the representations of Venus, and I was going to ask you if you've ever considered the horns of Venus, which these are two horns that get formed in the sky over the 8-year cycle in the east and the west. And I know a lot of 60s Norwegian archaeologists believed that Venus was represented as a horned goddess, whereas most males are represented as the horned god.
Right, Crononis, yeah.
Yeah, so I wondered if we could talk about Venus and how she appears and her most beautifully accurate geometric cycle of 5 and 8 years, and where was the birth of the worship of Venus?
I think the best thing to do is to look at Venus as it's the only thing that just appears in the night sky.
Yeah.
And she appears with the sun sometimes, even though the sun is so bright. And then she keeps climbing higher and higher when she appears in that night sky.
Mm-hmm.
And then, poof, she drops like a rock. And that in that first cycle, you can see her sometimes the next morning or 2 mornings afterwards. She'll be in the morning sky.
Yeah.
And then she'll be in the morning sky for maybe 4 months. And then there she is again, gone in the morning sky, and appears once more in the night sky, this time to stay there again for a few months, climbing higher and higher. But this time she disappears for maybe 3 months. You don't see her in the night sky. You don't see her in the morning sky. You go,
Yeah.
where did she go? Where did she go? And then poof, there she is in the morning again, where she appears before the sun.
Yeah.
You know that somehow she's related to the sun, but she's not really.
She's wild and independent.
The interesting thing that you just said about the horns, studying Venus in Minoan Mycenaean mythology, and especially in Minoan, she's depicted climbing up one side as the morning star of a triangle, a cone. They call it a cone. And then as on the other side, meeting, and in the later myths, meeting her lover Adonis at the climax at the top.
Yeah.
Or in the earlier myths, having an epiphany, and her visage changes so that it's not her face anymore, but it's these 2 antennas.
Yeah.
And you had just mentioned horns, right? Okay.
It comes up, but then when it drops, it forms the interior angle of the horn.
So the epiphany is the receiving of the horns, and then she becomes the evening star, and that's where she has sex with Adonis, or that's where she has an epiphany on her own, and she gets her antenna. And this is on the ring of Minos at Knossos.
Wonderful. So the antenna or the horns are depicted.
Right. Then the other side, and it's beautiful. She's streaming up there as the morning star. Then coming down the other side, she's with her lover. And that's beautiful. That's the night sky with the moon and Venus. And that's a time of pure love. Then she loses him to Persephone in the Greek myth, and she has to go fetch him in the underworld, and she has to go on this boat, get him from Persephone. Persephone gets him 1/3 of the year. She gets him 2/3 of the year, brings him back, and he's reborn. She's reborn. So when you think of, I'm always looking for resurrection beyond the male, beyond the Christian male concept. Like you said, she's a rebirth over and over again. But that rebirth is significantly different than the resurrection and the rebirth in the spring of the dying God, because there's sacrifice and there's suffering and there's maenads tearing him apart and there's blood and there's drinking, and this is love. This is that's what makes her Aphrodite.
Yeah.
Because when it's male and female together, and that's a different kind of a love associated with resurrection than the traditional resurrection deity. And that's what I find interesting. And it's depicted. The earliest, the Palaeolithics, always interested, I marked down some of the sites. Lascaux in Montagnac, an apse and a shaft of light coming in, an apse, with an altar in the back.
So you're describing some archaeological sites where these lunar phenomenon can be witnessed.
Yeah, Lascaux, excuse my pronunciation, Lascaux.
It would be Lascaux, yeah.
Okay. Right. And Pierre Plat, which is Neolithic, and that's in Brittany, France. Chavy in southern France, with the same thing. The one I visited was Les Assises du Taillac in the Dordogne, near the Loire Valley, and La Madeleine. Both of them are the reclining nudes, and the northwest, southeast orientation of these temples, which would be to cite Venus.
Uh-huh.
Right.
So could you pick one of those temples and explain to me how somebody's standing at the actual site? What would the experience?
Let me just do a broader view of them. Most of these temples in the classical era explains it better. The Morning Star is a chamber with an altar and 3 columns, and like you said, the 5 of Venus, and it's a rebirth, and with bathing, it especially in Knossos, temples to bathe in to renew yourself, coming out of the underworld, and her bathing. So with the sacred basins, then the northwest or the evening star. A huge bed, a chamber with a huge bed, and I think of the bed with the headboard that's Roman. I believe it was from Sicily, in the Boston Museum
with notches in it.
Yeah. So so that's that side of the temple. Sometimes several bed chambers, sometimes just one large one, probably for the high priestess, and then Newgrange measures it in the 4-year cycle. So I'll let Barbara describe what.
Please.
Or, Newgrange measures the Venus cycle as well.
Newgrange has its own roof box. It's known as the roof box.
Yes.
And the roof box is for Venus. And
okay, every 8 years, you say. So it's coming back to this position on the horizon.
Well, see, Venus goes up there twice in her cycle. That's how come we can get 584, which is larger than a year.
Yeah.
So she's not the same. Her cycle isn't the same as the solar cycle, but she's often with the sun enough. So at Newgrange, if you know that the sun is going to rise inside of Newgrange, you get up a couple of hours earlier because you can watch Venus trace the exact same lines inside of Newgrange as the sun will when the sun rises.
Let me ask you a very nuanced question about this. Professor Robert Lomas suggested that in some of these chambered cairns and passage tombs in Ireland and Scotland, that perhaps on the clearest of mornings, not only the sunlight and moonlight reflected in, but perhaps the silvery blue light of Venus. Do you think it's possible that the light of Venus lit up those inner chambers, especially Newgrange?
Sure. Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
It almost can shine light today. So imagine back 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, perhaps the light of Venus was much, much more significant.
Yeah.
And the cruciform chamber in the center of Newgrange is designed for rebirth because there's 2 ballons or half an egg that you can easily crawl in and in the fetal position. And there's 2 of those and an altar. So it's and then on the side of the chamber, the water lines are always significant with Venus again, and rising from the waters, from the underground waters. And a lot of these temples are facing the water so that you can see her come out of the water.
Yes.
I wanted to say that the huge bolon at Newgrange also has 3 circles.
Yeah.
And those 3 circles are the sun, the moon, and Venus.
Yeah. And it's almost an identical template to Maze How in Orkney. Maze How in Orkney is a smaller version of Newgrange, but again, you go up this passage and there's only one lintel inside that's lit on the winter solstice setting, 2 or 3 days on either side. But again, people believe that Venus is associated with that same, with that passage tomb as well. And it's the same inside. There's 3 antechambers. And I don't know if I'm going too far, but if you were to look at an MRI of a woman and look at her reproductive parts, those chambered cells with their 3 antechambers almost look like eggs within the womb, don't they?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course they are.
Do you think that's perhaps what they're aiming at?
Yeah, because you enter into the Mother Earth body, or what Anthony Murphy calls the tomb or the womb of the moon.
Wow, yes.
And you enter into that, and those would be the ovaries. Definitely. And then Malta, if you look at the Malta temples, they are the shape. The two together, or Demeter and Persephone, those are in the shape of a woman too. So and the caves were, at the back, that was the entering into the womb.
Maybe you could comment on this. Since you brought up Malta, I've interviewed Dr. Robert Barrett from the University of Belfast, who last year published a work on the 23 circular temples of Malta. He proposed that when he measured from the centres of the chambers looking out the portal, that they framed a period of time between November and February. Have you considered Venus in the context of these circular temples?
No.
No.
We're considering it now. You can hear the silence.
He didn't mention anything about Venetian astronomy, and I wondered if you'd ever looked at Venus in relation to the temples on Malta.
No.
Surely she would be represented in the Maltese temples, which predated Newgrange by, 600 or 800 years.
I did want to mention one thing when you were talking about the viewing in the site.
Yeah, please do.
Like at Stonehenge, they continued to redo the ditches on the outside of Stonehenge. And those were places where people could get in the ditch, they could stay warm, they could lean back on the back of the ditch, and then they could view what was going on.
With the stones as a foresight, or do you mean lying with your back to the stones using the ditch as a false horizon? Which way would you lie?
Well, I'm thinking more that they used the shadows of the stones. So they were looking at like my side of the stones. They were looking at the stones so they could see the shadows of the stones. The shadow, even at Newgrange, when the sunlight comes into Newgrange, the first thing that you see is the shadow coming.
Yes.
And I just was watching the eclipse recently from New Mexico, the most recent one in October, the middle of October. And what we were so impressed with again was the shadows that happened before the eclipse and the shadows that happened after the eclipse. They were just amazing as well.
Yeah. And cosmologically, in every esoteric belief system or religion, the shadow, the dark side, the opposition of light is as significant as light is. There's a wonderful thing happens here because in Colombia we're in the tropics. We have the zenith passing twice a year. The sun is directly above you at midday, and for those few seconds there are no shadows.
All right.
It's when the indigenous cultures believe the male sun god inseminated the female earth goddess through the stones because no shadow appears. There's a visual synchronization between the male sun and the bountiful female earth. And I talked to Dr. Ed Bernhardt about the zenith passing in Imagine temples. He sees it there. And also the zenith passing in Cambodia, which is also in that same band. And also regarding shadows, if you look at all the traditional books of archaeoastronomy and ancient astronomy, you see pictures of little guys with staffs looking at the sun setting on the horizon. You ever tried looking directly into the sun on the horizon? What's required is almost a reversal of methodology because it must have all been done on boxing the shadow of the sun. Not looking at the sun, but these people were masters of the shadow. They must have been.
Going back to the Malta question, I found what we wrote about it. I'll read it to you quickly.
Great, please.
It's from the mythology of Venus, which is chapter 1 on my academia.edu site. The temple complex at Hajar-Im, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, at Hajar-Im is a megalithic temple complex facing the sea on the island of Malta, dating to approximately 3600 BC, with a trilithon entrance, chambers of red ochre, and doorways that open to small chambers, one of which is an oracle chamber. Most importantly, Hajar-Im was most likely used as a temple of the Regeneratrix associated with the planet Venus. The temple complex faces the sea on its western side, giving full view of Venus rising from the sea as the evening star in three distinct positions in relation to the moon. Each of the three chambers on the western side of the temple complex has outside entrances that orient to these celestial sightings. A small semicircular niche housing a triangular altar stone outside the temple faces northeast, the site of the solstices, equinoxes, and the rising constellations, as well as Venus. On the east side of the temple, the oracle chamber views Venus as the morning star in position from due east. The third sighting of Venus in the east as the morning star is through the main entrance, which faces southeast. The position of Venus furthest in the east, most likely associated with her beginning and or ending of each complete cycle. The main entrance itself is a spectacular triathlon with 8 entrance stones, the number of the full cycle of Venus in conjunction with 99 moons. So that's how Venus ties the moon, the sun. She's the third, the cone. She's the triangle. She's the third piece in the puzzle of the moon and the sun.
I just want to mention, too, that Venus, 15 times Venus is half of the Metonic cycle. And our calendar, we figured out, is consistent with the 19-year cycle of the moon. And so no wonder Venus is so accurately measured in there. I didn't know until I just followed it on Voyager star maps. I followed all of the markings for Venus, which they said called it Inus, I-N-I-S or I-N-N-I-S if it was 2 sightings of Venus. And when I started looking at the pictures that they told me to look at on Voyager, I had never seen such gorgeous pictures of Venus, every single one of them. It was just a real charm to go through their Venus calendar.
That's superb. When you were telling me the story of Aphrodite and Venus appearing and running and coming back, you were almost describing the Norse stories of Frigg and Freya, the split personality goddess who had the ability to run to the horizon and disappear.
Right.
The god couldn't find her anywhere, and then all of a sudden she'd appear behind him, and you're like, oh, look at that.
Right.
The invisible, disappearing, troublesome, mischievous goddess that you couldn't quite pin down.
Right.
I said at the beginning that I had something to share with you and to show you. So what I'd like to do is tell you a story about what happened here 4 years ago, and then I'll show you the thing. When Jimenez Quesada the Conquistador arrived in Colombia in 1537, he made a move on the chief temple of the sun and recovered somewhere between 20 and 30 tons of golden artifacts. Then he made a move on the chief temple of the moon in the southern Muisca Confederacy, and it was described as being plated with unbounded quantities of silver, which was known as tears of the moon. Gold was semen of the sun, gold offerings were made to the sun, and the moon was silver. Now, the moon goddess was known as Chia. She was depicted in mythology as a pregnant goddess. Now, it was a matrilineal society. So, the current ruler, the Zipa, the next ruler would be the oldest son of his sister. So the Zipa, the ruler's sister, represented the high priestess of the moon at the chief temple of the moon in Chia. So, when Quesada arrived at the chief temple of the moon, he discovered that it had been packed away, and it was disappeared into the hills to the west of the city of the moon, Chia. So, 8 years ago, I got to exploring the hills to the west of the city of the moon in Chia. And at 2,700 meters on a hill known as the Tequisa Hill, I discovered a church, an 18th century church. And it was on a platform. And that platform looks directly over the valley so that on the equinox, the sun sets behind a mountain known as Waitaka, who is the youngest rebellion goddess of the moon. This is our moon mountain. So my assumption was perhaps this church has been built upon a lunar temple. So 4 years ago, I flew 8 researchers, and Walter Payne from Nebraska worked for Spacecom at the time. He's a specialist in remote sensing with drones and LiDAR and metal detecting. Walter came along and I took him to the platforma around the base of the church. We got permission from the private landowner. And Walter swooped his metal detector, big drum roll, here it comes. And he found this.
Oh, wow.
Which is the tiniest representation of Chia, the goddess of the moon, with her full moon pregnant belly and full breasts.
Aw.
It looks like there's an indentation in her belly. It looks like a hole.
So we think there was an emerald in there.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Or perhaps it looks like an abalone shell, so maybe it just represents the full moon.
Right.
But look at her full cheeks,
Right.
and she has a metal skull cap on. In the 1960s, 64, the indigenous people of Colombia said, we don't have any personification of Chia, our 1,200-year-old moon goddess. And they gathered all of the indigenous stories of Chia together, and an artist made this sculpture in the City of the Moon, which is their indigenous conglomeration of all their myths, which shows the moon goddess with the next Zipa, the child. And this is what Walter found.
Wow.
That's
Nice.
right.
Well,
Isn't it just absolutely beautiful, the pregnant goddess of the moon?
Right.
So there's a high chance that we've discovered a lost temple of the moon in Colombia that has vanished since 1537. And what I was going to ask the two of you is if Walter and I could perhaps send you a map of where this temple is, show you a map of where the central temple of the moon was, and perhaps you could see some relevant alignments, orientations, positioning, and that could help us further determine if this is the temple of the moon or not, because guess what? We cannot get permission from the Catholic Church to do an excavation because it's surrounded by a cemetery.
Oh.
But what we can do and do have is permission to excavate and metal detect in the fields surrounding the temple where this little lovely came from, and goodness knows what might be beneath that building.
Oh, no, not at all. No, that'd be great.
But I'd love to get your opinion because you're so steeped in lunar mythology, in lunar astronomy as well. And
Right.
let me show you. Can you see the top of her head? There's this hole in it. See the hole?
oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
So what we think is this one is mixed with an alloy called tumbaga, gold, silver, and copper mixed together, and it forms this bronzy color. But when the air rises out of the lost wax casting process, you can get an air bubble, and it seems to have bubbled out of her head. So we think at a site of production, someone's virtually gone over the shoulder, on with the next one.
Right.
And this
Right.
perhaps was to be resmelted. However, it's the only personification of a lunar goddess that's been discovered in Colombia, because all of the artifacts dedicated to her that have been found show 13 circles. That's what she was represented, was a triangle and 13 circles, but this is the first time she's been visualized.
Another possibility might be that she reminds me of the Venus figurines. And back to the Doli Vestinese, they had sometimes put a headdress on her.
Yeah.
And the Celts often decorate their statues with jewelry. So if it's a purposeful hole, it could have been for a headdress of some type.
Oh, wow. There's a thought now. So it's perhaps not an imperfection, but it was covered because Chia was depicted with a triangular skull cap, but here she only has the face part of the skull cap. So perhaps there was a pointed silver top, perhaps like the belly.
Or a crown of some type. And she has a headdress. And the one you're holding up, she has a headdress.
Wow, Walter's going to love this.
And then, quote, the Doli Vestinese had a headdress. And then the Celtic statues, often they decorate statues of the mother goddess with jewelry.
Yep.
And you've already got jewelry here, so why not have another piece of jewelry on the top? And any priestess would be wearing a headdress, not bareheaded.
Yeah.
The high priestess would be wearing, a crown of some
Yeah,
type,
that's it.
which symbolizes the celestial, her connection to the celestial.
It's known that the high priestess of the moon, who was the mother of the next Zipa.
Right.
So she was, as I said, the controller of all fluid aspects. And there's a beautiful story I'm going to tell you, because you can perhaps see this in context with your own studies. There's a foundational flood myth where Bochica, the male sun god, relieved the savannah from a flood. He smashed his staff. He founded a waterfall. The savannah lost its waters, but he blamed his wife Chia for causing the waters, his rebellious goddess wife Chia. So what he did was he cast her to the moon as a white owl to forever fly in the night sky. But archaeologists and historians believe what that transition, Bochica casting Chia to the sky, represents is the collapse of the matriarchy and the rise of the patriarchy and a solar.
Yeah.
You agree with that? You think that's?
Oh, totally.
Do you
totally.
see that in France? Do you see it? Was it the coming of the Romans? When was that transition from lunar to solar?
The beginning of the Iron Age in Greece and in Europe and the Celtic countries at the beginning of the Iron Age.
And then Germanic and Norway as well. Again, the priestess or the most fertile woman would lead the local tribes, but then it collapsed to the strongest male at the beginning of the Iron Age.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, when in the Greek mythology, it's very evident.
Aye.
With the Titans and with the transference to, and then there's a third stage, and that's the transference for the powers of the hero to the demigod.
Yeah.
I can say in the Lakota Sioux sent runners they were in Nebraska, and they sent runners through Kansas to see if Formahote, which they called the Twin Ducks, were rising yet. Because as soon as those runners got back from Kansas, which is a big space to get run from, as soon as they got back, they planned the buffalo hunt. But what I want to tell you is that before the horses came, the entire tribe, except the old women and baby children, went on the buffalo hunt. Every single person in the tribe went to the buffalo hunt, except for the grandmothers.
So I'm hearing lots of knocking coming over your voice. I'm not sure what that is.
Oh, it's me pounding on the book. Sorry.
I'm going to leave this in because it's quite funny, because again, I thought someone was knocking at my door, but this is you pounding your point home.
Making a point.
It's just so important to know that the horses took away the power of the tribe and gave it to the biggest men that had to then go on the buffalo hunt and leave all the women and the children at home.
Yeah.
Oh, I know what I was going to say. I remember Persephone had to marry Hades. Artemis, the young daughter, was very independent, but she had to get a brother, Apollo. The Hera, the summer goddess, the goddess of the calendar, was the most violent in opposition to having a husband, Zeus. And the major, so I thought that was interesting, that the older women and the crones were the ones that were like, no, we still have the knowledge of the calendars. We're the timekeepers, and we're the ones who are going to fight the strongest against the patriarchy.
There you go.
Because they were the ones that had the control of the moon, the cycles, and all the knowledge of timekeepers. I call them the timekeepers.
Here, when the moon goddess was banned and there was a rise of a solar religion, they actually destroyed all of the lunar temples, and there was this rise of solar astronomy. But a lot of modern historians suggest that it wasn't an indigenous patriarchy taking over the indigenous matriarchy, but what it was the arrival of the conquistadors, the Spaniards, with their it would be a Gregorian calendar, wouldn't it, at the time? And that was the actual mark. So I'm not quite sure.
With the overtaking of the matrilocal, not matriarchy. This was matrilocal. I explained that. One god, three goddesses, right.
Matrilocal, that's great.
That came with the Indo-European invasions. And the Indo-Europeans were also warriors. So it came with and I think that's where they got the idea of the centaurs, a man on a horse.
Yeah.
It came with that, and it came with the superior weaponry and the whole system of the Indo-Europeans.
Yeah.
So it came with war.
Yeah. I wonder if you can see the relevance in this. In the story of the goddess here, the moon goddess, she's Waitaka, the young rebellious goddess, waxing moon. Chia, the fertile goddess, full moon. And then there's a moment called the transmutation of Chia, where Chia becomes Bachwe, the crone, but also the mother goddess. What happened to Bachwe? She transmuted into the Virgin Mary. So it's like they let the moon goddess survive that was easiest to transform and sell as the Virgin Mary. But if you want to find old moon temples here, you find the church is dedicated to the Virgin Mary because they were built upon the moon temples.
Well, in the temples of Mithraeus, the Mithraic cult, which was underground in Rome, the exact same goddess survived. And it was the moon goddess and then eventually into Mary, or Mary Magdalene. So the same thing happened in Europe.
Yeah.
And it was the moon. In the Mithraic cult, if you look at in Rome, the underground temple, the moon is on this side and a woman looking like Mary is on the other side. So that was the only goddess that was retained by the Mithraic cult. And she's pointing, and this is what I always found.
Pointing where?
Like the one Venus of La Salle that's on the side of a cave really looks pregnant, but 3 months pregnant. And that's always mystified me. Why is she that having children? It's a beautiful state. It's a beatific state.
But you must have found back then that most children were lost before the 3 months. And if you got to the 3 months, the probability was increased. Maybe
you were safe. Second trimester.
There you go. The second trimester was maybe the here we go sign.
It's a beatific state anyway. My daughter, I have a new grandson. His name's Fox. And the last trimester is difficult. It reminded me. So yeah, it's that beatific state of the mother. Not quite,
Yeah.
I also want to mention that the calendar, the Gregorian calendar, marked Jesus born at 0 BC, 0 AD, but they didn't understand zero. They didn't know what zero was, so they picked a non-year to bring this about. The South Americans already knew that 0 means on the way to something or on the way from something.
Yeah.
And the same with our calendar also marks this is the first day of 7 days around the moon. And we don't have a 0 in our calendar.
There's no 0 in Moisca or Andean cosmology, where they began with 1 finger, 2 fingers, 3 fingers. There was never no fingers.
No finger.
1 finger. The 0 didn't exist.
Well, it exists on the Roman calendar in solar time because it's linear. It starts at the 0 mark, and I think of it as a straight line. But our calendar and these ancient calendars are more realistic because they're measuring the night sky beyond the sun, and they go in circles.
Yes.
So and concentric circles. And then the U, and I don't know if we mentioned this, the U of the 19-year cycle is the moon measured in the horns of Taurus. So ours is more practical or pragmatic. That's the U.
Yeah. Now, when do you think the lunar calendar was monumentalized? Was it around 3000, 4000 BC? And what I mean by that, when were the actual architectural efforts made to enshrine the lunar cycle, whether it's in the orientations of the stones, the production of the calendar? When do you think the first effort at monumentalization was?
I would say Woodhenge.
Woodhenge.
It's before Stonehenge, right? And Newgrange, before it was a monument, it was just there on the ground. Just when they started putting stones on the ground and making a contextual whole of it.
Yeah.
In Greece, I don't know. Greece probably. Mycenae is very old site. Athens, all the Acropolises, and if you go out in Mycenae, there's a temple to Hera, Athena, and then Venus's temple. Venus temples in Greece are always, as you come in, you're dusty, you're dirty, there's a restaurant, there's a bar, you relax for 2 or 3 days, then you go to Apollo's temple, then you go to Asclepius for your healing. But Venus is always the welcome point.
Really?
And literally the myrtle trees and the bathing and it's the welcome point. So I would say in Mycenae, Venus temple is right at the bottom before you start walking up to the to the top.
Yeah.
And the same thing at Acrocorinth. So I would say that whenever Mycenae goes back to the Gigantes who built the megalithic structure walls. So that would be what the very early Neolithic, I don't want to give a date, but 14,000, 9,000. And the oldest one that they're looking at now, archaeologists, is Göbekli Tepe. That dates 14,000 BC. And they found a calendar on that. And
I thought it was 9,800.
Well, they found one that there's markings of the winter solstice with the same constellations that we have on the calendar. So they found winter solstice markings, but I don't know if they found anything else, which would be what? Winter solstice markings, Orion.
Yeah, there's one stone in particular which has 3 or 4 animals carved in it, and there was one particular paper. I'll tell you what happened there is the paper was published about 6 years ago, and it appeared to be a stand-up piece of archaeology, but it was picked up by Graham Hancock recently. And of course, now academia just refers to it as this is New Age. Hancock's talked about it. So the actual constellations, if they are there, have been kind of poo-pooed greatly.
Right.
I can tell you something about the moon before we wrap this up, which you might find interesting. I talked to Dr. Timothy Pocketat, who's a specialist at the Cahokia Mounds in the American Southwest.
Mm-hmm.
But he's a specialist in the lunar orientations of the buildings at that site. And we discussed that. And I told him about an aspect of the moon in prehistory that I'm studying myself. It's going to sound bananas, but I do this. I live beside a piece of land which has been a farm for at least 1,500 years. It was an indigenous high-rise in the savannah. So there's a Spanish settlement on it, and beside my house, out my window here, I have a 500-year-old well, a water well. And what I do is I record the frog patterns at different stages of the moon.
Wow.
And what I told Timothy is after having done it for 4 or 5 months now, even if I can't see the moon in the sky, I can close my eyes and just listen, and I can tell you roughly where we are in the month by the volume, the mating of the frogs. But vice versa, if I could only see the moon and I had earmuffs on, I could tell you how erratic the frogs were, or whether they were silent, just by looking at the moon. So I think there was perhaps a whole auditory cosmology associated to the moon that's completely lost now with the environments having changed so much.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with that?
I know. I totally believe that too.
Yeah.
Totally. I think everything's off balance, definitely, because of climate change. And that's why I'm emphasizing our calendar. I wrote that in the introduction to the calendar, called an article called Metempsychosis and the Moon, because the stars are the only constant left. The stars and the moon and the sun are the only constant left when we're experiencing so much global change. So we really need to look up and learn that so that we can know what moon we're on, because right now we're in West Virginia mountains. It's hot, it's cold, it's like, it's getting so, and the deer are coming right to my backyard and sitting at my back door looking at me.
Do you have a ticket?
Right. It's like, please tell us what's going on. So it's getting pretty crazy out there. And learning to tell time by the night sky is essential for us now, so that we can grasp those rhythms and try to and realize that we're all connected. Even the frogs, the fish, the trout, everything here, salmon, everybody's connected. And we have to realize that.
Yeah. The whole world seems to be focused on the spectacular, not on the functional, not on what actually happens, but it's all about movies and distraction and games and booze and drugs. And there's a great interest in the spectacular, but I'm going to teach my son how to look at the moon and count time, what the sun does, because this is knowledge where the world seems to have access to information and everybody's a specialist on everything.
Right.
I think having knowledge of those cycles is so important, because a watch is spectacular, really.
Yeah.
You want to know what the moon's doing and where the watch came from. You don't want to just wear a watch. I think you should know why a watch is a watch.
Right. If you don't mind, could I read a sentence from the Metempsychosis on the Moon? And I just gave an exam, and all of my freshmen who are 19 years old, and I'm teaching them the 19-year cycle, are all like, oh my God, we fit in somewhere. In an era where patterns are indiscernible, change imminent, and chaos looming, the natural cycles of the world and the rhythms of nature draw us near. The cycles of the moon, the sun, and the stars, more than other patterns in nature, in such a climate change and human mutability, offer an infinitely steady and sure natural pattern that flows with time and guides us through change. The ancients charted the cycles of the celestial bodies in an effort to draw down the sky, connecting it to the earth and uniting both spheres in order that human experience could benefit from the infinite pattern of the heavens. And I say we might follow the ancients in this path.
It's fantastic, isn't it?
So I think it is our path back to finding some security.
If you look at what you've talked about today, suggesting that lunar astronomy and an understanding of the cycles goes deep into Paleolithic history, what we've done in the last 200 years is quite possibly going to be forgotten about as an accident that we had, because we were with the moon for much longer than we've been away from her.
Longer.
It's like we're having a crazy vacation, but
Right.
we might just be back
Right.
to her quite soon.
Right.
I think at that note, I must say thank you to both of you, Helen and Barbara, for the last hour and a half. I have found it absolutely enlightening. I am going to sound so good next time because I'm going to be talking about predictable meteor showers as if it was mine. And that's just to begin what I'm going to lift from this.
Okay, don't forget to go to the next one. When did Clay say he wants us to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning?
On the 15th.
Is that right?
On the 15th. It's coming right up next week. Next week.
Visible from where? Which latitudes? From everywhere? Do you know? Is it particular to latitude?
Well, they're the Perseus meteor showers. The trick with meteor showers is that the meteor itself has unleashed itself from the last circle of the sun and has crashed into the universe where it's split apart. And so it's still hanging in there in its split apart place. So you have to look before the sun comes up so that you're looking in the right direction where you're looking for the meteors. Look in the right direction right before the sun comes up. This is a big one, so you should be able to see some meteors.
I think he said the 13th.
3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, and then it's too late. Then you missed them. You might see one at 9 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night, better chance at 12, even better chance at 1. 3 o'clock in the morning is the time to get up and watch meteor showers.
When you say meteor shower, are you talking about the classic shooting star?
Yes, all of them.
All of them.
All of them.
I think he said the 13th because I'm going to D.C.
Oh, okay, the 13th.
And I just kind of dismiss it. I'm like, oh, I'm not getting up, Clay. That's her husband.
Oh, yeah. I've got a nice one for you just before we go. I thought I would throw this at you, and I forgot throughout the conversation, with you both having highlighted the significance of the number 13 in lunar astronomy, and with one of your works about mythology having discussed the correlations between the goddess and the bull.
Yeah.
Yeah?
That's another whole topic.
Yeah, but guess what I found out before the call? Now, this is an average, but a bull enters puberty and becomes fertile on the 13th month.
Oh, there you go. There you go. It all fits together. They figured it all out.
Her birthday is April 13th.
And
my birthday is September 13th.
So you're going to a couple of 13s.
I'm maybe not going to put this in because they're going to think we're all a bunch of numerologists, and
right.
Not everybody knows. There's two versions of that word, isn't there? There's woo New Age numerology, and then there's astronomy-derived numerology.
Right. No, yeah.
But anyway, ladies, thank you very much again for coming on. It'll be a fantastic episode.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Okay,
Thank
keep
you.
in touch.
I will. If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe, drop a 5-star review or share it with a friend. And you can get in touch with me through historyfuzz.com.